Hi, it's Ashleigh from Sweet Dreams Bake Shop, and I have been having quite the weekend trying to come up with all of these different frozen treats that I've been making for my daughter's 4th birthday. Here I am sketching what my frozen cake is possibly going to look like. Now I do make a few changes here and there, but for the most part it does turn out kind of like this. Thank you to all of you that watched my first live stream yesterday, and you may have caught a glimpse of this cake, but now I'm going to be showing you how I made it from start to finish. So firstly, what I'm doing here is I'm starting off with the horse. I want the horse to be very solidified when I put it on the cake, so that's why I'm actually starting with this first. You'll notice here that I'm tracing the outline of the horse so that I have two opposite sides of the horse. If I did it both on the same side, then one side would end up flat when I want them both kind of puffy. So what I'm doing here is I'm mixing in a little bit of Tylose powder into my fondant. The reason that we use Tylose is so that it hardens very quickly. Now, one of the downsides of using Tylose is if you're just kind of starting out working with fondant, you need to make sure that you don't fiddle around with it too much. If you fiddle around with it when it has Tylose in it, then you're going to end up with a lot of cracking. So I will say that Tylose does require you to work just a little bit faster. I'm using the outline to help dictate where I'm going to put these fondant pieces. Now I will say that if you want your horse to be a little bit more 3D and puffy looking, that you really round out that fondant and pile a little bit more fondant on there so it stays nice and popped out. I'm okay with this looking a little bit more 2D, so I'm flattening out the edges just a little bit more. Be sure to do this twice so you have two sides of your horse. Now you'll notice the horse outline that I'm using is not really from the Frozen movie, but you can really use any old horse, and what we do afterwards makes it look like the horse from Frozen. So I did let this rest overnight, mainly because I do want those legs to really be solidified. What I'm using here is slightly melted white chocolate candy melts. Now the reason I say slightly melted is so that it solidifies a lot faster. Once again, I'm going to let that horse rest. While I'm letting that rest, I'm actually taking this cake that I had beforehand, and I will show you what it looks like right here. And because Styrofoam is fairly expensive, I always try to reuse these fake tears whenever I am using them. So what I did was I took off all of those little diamonds that were encrusted on there, and now I'm going through and I'm airbrushing. Now I always wanted this to be part of what I was doing with this, so this works out perfectly. If I wanted to do something completely different, then I could take off all of the fondant on here as well and start from scratch. But I figure I'm in a rush because I'm doing a bunch of things for this party as it is, so I want to make things as easy on myself as possible. And this silver airbrush is from Americolor, and I believe the color is called Silver, and it's actually really nice and shiny. I want this whole cake to have an ombre feel, so I'm going through with some blue as well. I believe this is electric blue in the Americolor line, also an airbrush color as well. Now I'm going in with some blue sheen, and the blue sheen is a little bit different. It's lighter in color and it's also a lot more sparkly. Whenever you are using your airbrush, it's really important to always keep it moving. If you keep it in one spot for too long, then you're going to get uneven coloring. Doing some more deconstruction here. I'm taking off all of those little gems, and this is the beauty of using a fake cake, and I always like to do this whenever I'm doing my children's birthday parties or I'm doing events where there's not really going to be that many people eating this much cake, but you want the look of a really awesome, spectacular cake. So I am going to be using one real tear on the very top, but everything else is going to be fake. I also highly recommend this option for weddings as well. Now these little pedestals here were already pretty secured, but one of them popped off, so I'm putting them back in with some hot glue. Again, that is the beauty of using a fake cake. I'm also going to adhere the top portion here with a little bit more hot glue. Fun fact, this original cake that was a display cake went through a lot of changes in a very short period of time. We had originally put my mother's face on the front of the cake, and then we changed it to a 60 about like 10 minutes before the party started. I'm actually having to stand on a ladder to do this portion, and I am mimicking the other portion that I did before, so I'm making sure that I'm ombreing all of that airbrush together. Now, the reason I'm sticking to a lot of silvers and blues is because that's the color palette that I saw in the first movie, and my daughter has the dress from the first movie. So even though we have that horse in there, I also still wanted to make it more Frozen 1 looking. What I'm doing now is I'm working on the paneling for the ice castle portion. So all I'm doing is I'm making strips that are even in width but uneven in height and a little bit jagged looking, and then we're going to put it on that center tier. Anytime you're working with fondant, you want to make sure that you put down a little bit of cornstarch to avoid any sticking. As you go throughout the process, you might need to add a little bit more glue for stability. Now I'm taking my steamer so that I can attach these pieces really easily. And you're going to notice all throughout this tutorial, I'm going to be using my steamer to adhere all my fondant to fondant. It really is a time saver. If you don't have a steamer, you can always use water and a paintbrush, but it is going to take you a lot longer to accomplish things. You can keep it at one layer of the paneling, but I always like to layer up so that it looks more like a jagged ice castle that's popping out at you. To create all of these little snowflakes that I'm putting on here, all you have to do is roll out your fondant nice and thin and then use punch cutters that are in the shape of snowflakes and put them on. Now we're going to go back to working on that horse. So what I'm going to be using is some Isomalt because I really want the horse's mane to be nice and glassy looking. I'm first going to apply some white chocolate to actually put the horse onto the cake. And remember, I'm using that semi-melted white chocolate so that it adheres really quickly. Now I'm going to create the mane, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to use this little tiny spatula and some Isomalt, and then I'm going to create kind of little rainbow arcs with a little bit of a flip at the end. Working with Isomalt is really easy, but you do need a nonstick mat. You will also need a spatula that can handle heat, and you will also need to heat up this Isomalt for about 45 seconds to a minute and 30 seconds. And then what you do is you just take the Isomalt when it's kind of a little bit warm still, and you stick it right directly into your fondant. The reason I say to do it when it's a little bit warm still is so that you can just kind of melt it into that fondant, and then you just let it go. I found that when I fiddled with it too much, that things started kind of flopping over. But when I just let that Isomalt go, it just stayed in its spot and then it hardened really quickly afterwards. When creating the Isomalt for the tail, I just made sure to make longer strands. To create these icicles, I basically did the same thing, except I just took my spatula and I swiped it through to create that long strand of icicles. And then to adhere them, I did the exact same thing as I did with the mane. If you're finding they're not adhering, you just take it and you dip it back into the melted Isomalt and then just stick it into your cake quickly. I want the horse to look like it's coming out of the water, so I'm creating these big splashes. And all you do is the exact same way I treated all of the other Isomalt. I kind of hold it there for a little bit longer though because it is a larger piece, so it takes a little while for it to really solidify. Now it's time for some more airbrushing, and I'm going in with my blue sheen again, and I'm really directing it to the root of the mane so that the ends remain clear. Because if you've ever seen the movie before, I really loved this scene when the horse comes out of the water, so I really wanted to mimic that. And water is not completely blue. There are some clear parts to it as well. Now I'm choosing to airbrush directly onto the cake because I find that's easier for me, but if you find you don't have the same type of control with your airbrush, you could totally do this part first, but you will have to let that airbrush dry before you put it onto your cake. I want to give that ice castle a little bit more depth as well, and when I've watched this scene many times, I noticed that there's a lot of blues in it too, so I'm going to airbrush the blue. Now the way I'm deciding where to put the airbrush, I'm just putting it in all of those cracks. Now you might be wondering why I'm switching from tier to tier, kind of doing some things and then leaving it. This is kind of my cake process, especially when I'm working on a display cake and I have the luxury of time. I kind of just keep going to see what will work and what won't. So I'm all about repurposing and reusing things in different ways. So these are the jewels that I ripped off earlier. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut off all the bits that have kind of been damaged from me ripping it off, and I'm going to keep all of those really beautiful things that I can still keep using. I believe these were originally purchased from the dollar store. You can adhere these gems in a number of ways, but I want really clear lines. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be steaming that cake and then putting them on. This is a little bit of a riskier way to do things. If you want it to be ultra stable, I suggest you use something like hot glue, but of course with the hot glue you do run the risk of being able to see little bits of the hot glue. Plus it does take a lot longer to actually hot glue on all of these things, where it's a lot easier for me to steam it. Now it's time for me to make my little Elsa fondant 2D applique, and all I'm doing is I'm taking a little coloring sheet of Elsa and then I'm going to cut around it, and then you'll notice what I'm doing is I'm going to take my little cake tool and I'm going to indent. I have used this trick a number of times. It works really well with 2D things. Now you totally don't have to do this part. If you feel comfortable freehanding the painting, then by all means do that. I just like to have a guide, and this won't make it perfect, but it just allows me to know where the eyes start and end, which for me is the most difficult part to get right. And now I'm going back in and I'm re-indenting all of the parts that didn't quite indent enough for me. Now, because I want Elsa's face nice and rounded to the cake, I'm actually going to apply this applique right away, and then I'm going to hand paint directly on there. You could hand paint on it first and then put it on, but then you have to wait for it to dry. I always use my airbrush colors to paint on. You can use your edible food gels and then mix it with some vodka to paint on instead, but I just like doing this for expediency's sake. Now what I'm doing first is I'm outlining everything that I know is going to be a much darker outline, so her eyes, her eyebrows, and her nose area, and then everything else I'm going to kind of color in afterwards. I found the toughest part was her actual skin color, so what I did was I applied a little bit darker of an edge on the outside, and then with a larger brush I took a bunch of white food coloring and I kind of mixed it in there, and then I drag it inwards. Now it's time for Elsa's hair, and I really found that it really helped to look at the drawing that I originally used, and then I just kind of made pieces using that drawing. And I want to make sure that this is more 3D than the face itself. I want her hair to pop. To make her cape here, I rolled this fondant super thin, and then I steamed the cake to make it really easy to put this cape on. And then I took my airbrush and I made sure to kind of go where the crevices were to airbrush that. Now, I would have preferred an icier blonde, which I could have done with a little bit more white food coloring. And I do add in food coloring afterwards, but it still doesn't get quite to that icy appearance that I want. Time for some more snowflakes. We are now at the stage of making our real cake on the very top, and this is a very, very small cake. If you watched my live, you saw me crumb coat this cake, and I'm just adding one more coat. After rolling out the fondant, place it on top, and I do get a little bit of ripping that happens, but I'm not too worried about it because my whole plan is to put a bunch of snowflakes on this anyway. And the reason that the ripping occurs is because my fondant is quite thick at the very bottom, so it kind of dragged it down. And I do find with a smaller cake, it is harder to kind of cover it perfectly, especially because it's so tall as well. So I do find that process of covering a 6-inch cake actually a lot easier. And yet again, more snowflakes, but don't worry, this is the last time we cut out any more snowflakes. Be super fearless and put that cake right on the top. Steam your cake and then add on all of those little snowflakes. Now, I know that was a much longer tutorial than I normally do for my cakes, but this cake did take me almost 7 days to complete. And did I also mention that this cake lights up? Yes, it does. And if you want to make your cakes light up, it's actually really, really easy. You just need to use lights that are battery operated, and then you take it and you just kind of glue it to the underside of the cake so that you can't see it. Now let's get into the pricing for this cake. Now, I know that this is a display cake, so you might think it would be a little bit cheaper, and it will be slightly cheaper than that of a real cake, because if this was all real, there would be a lot of structural issues we would have to deal with. But because a lot of it is fake, we can do things like hot glue it, so it does make it a bit easier. That being said, there's still a lot of fondant. There's lights, there's airbrushing, there's that horse in the center, there is Isomalt work. And there's also the hand-painted Elsa at the bottom, not to mention just the sheer volume of cake that we have as well. So this cake would be $1,900 Canadian. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can be part of the Sweetie fam. Right now, I'm uploading daily, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Also, be sure to comment, request, or ask a question. I love hearing from you guys. Bye!